October 28th, 1707. Far out beneath the ocean, off the southern coast of Japan, the seafloor tears apart. The earthquake that follows is among the largest in the recorded history of the country, a magnitude near 8.7, the only quake ever known to rupture the entire Nankai megathrust at once. A tsunami rises and kills more than 5,000 people along the coast. For everyone who lives through it, this is the disaster of a lifetime, complete in itself. But the Great Quake has done something else, something no one can see. 200 kilometers to the northeast, beneath the most famous mountain in Japan, the stress of that rupture has reached down into the magma of Mount Fuji and begun to push it toward the surface. For 49 days, the mountain mutters. Small earthquakes shake the villages at its base. And then, on the 16th of December, Fuji opens its side and begins to erupt. It throws roughly 800 million cubic meters of ash over eastern Japan, burying the farmland and coating the capital 100 kilometers away, until the people there need lamps at noon. And yet, the eruption itself kills almost no one. What it kills is the harvest. In a land that measures survival one season at a time, a buried field means hunger, and hunger means death by the slow arithmetic of famine. This is the story of the last time Mount Fuji erupted. An eruption that began with an earthquake out at sea and ended in a famine that lasted for years. To understand what happened, you have to go back more than 300 years, to a Japan that measured its wealth in rice and looked at one mountain above all others as a fixed and permanent thing. In the autumn of 1707, Mount Fuji was already the most recognized shape in the country. It rose alone above the plains of central Honshu, snow on its shoulders, a near-perfect cone that artists drew and poets praised, and ordinary people treated almost as a piece of the sky itself. To the farmers who worked the fields along its eastern foot, the mountain was not a danger. It was the backdrop to every harvest, every wedding, every funeral. Nobody alive had seen it do anything but stand there. That was the first thing that made the region vulnerable. The people who lived closest to Fuji had no memory of it erupting, no reason to fear it, and no plan for what to do if it ever woke. Their lives were built on a thin margin. In this part of Japan, survival ran through the rice paddy and the vegetable field, through irrigation channels carved into volcanic soil, through a single growing season that had to come in. There was very little stored against disaster. One ruined harvest meant hunger, two meant famine. And the fields that fed them sat directly on the eastern and southeastern flanks of the mountain, downwind of event that did not yet exist. The second vulnerability was buried far below, where no one in 1707 could have looked. Mount Fuji stands at one of the most complicated meeting points of the planet's crust anywhere on Earth. 3 enormous tectonic plates converge beneath central Japan and grind against one another without pause. From the surface of the mountain, a system of cracks and conduits reaches down some 20 kilometers into the rock, connecting chambers of molten magma to the open air above. Fuji was not a quiet ornament above the plains. It was a loaded structure, waiting for something to disturb the pressure inside it. That something was coming. And it would not begin at the mountain at all. It would begin out at sea. On October 28, 1707, the ocean floor off the southern coast of Japan broke apart. The earthquake that followed is still, 3 centuries later, one of the largest in the recorded history of the country. Modern seismologists estimate its magnitude at around 8.6 to 8.7. It ruptured a feature called the Nankai Trough, a long subduction zone where one plate dives beneath another off Japan's Pacific coast. What made this quake extraordinary was its reach. To this day, it is the only earthquake known to have ruptured every segment of the Nankai megathrust at the same time, the whole length of that great fault failing at once. The shaking was felt across enormous stretches of the country, and then the sea rose. The tsunami generated by the quake swept into coastal communities along the Kii Peninsula and the island of Kyushu, and it alone killed more than 5,000 people. For the survivors, this was already the disaster of a generation, a catastrophe complete in itself. What almost none of them understood was that the earthquake had done something else, something invisible far to the northeast, beneath the most famous mountain in Japan. The enormous tectonic stress released by that rupture had reached Fuji and changed the forces pressing on the magma system inside it. Researchers who studied the event centuries later concluded that the Great Quake squeezed and then released parts of the mountain's underground plumbing, allowing molten rock from far below to begin forcing its way upward. There had been an earlier shock, too, a powerful earthquake 4 years before on a different fault that had already loaded the system. The events stacked. The Nankai quake was the final push. The mountain had been armed. The only question now was how long the fuse would burn. The answer was 49 days. For 7 weeks after the great earthquake, Fuji gave its warnings, though no one at the time could have read them as a countdown. Small earthquakes began to be felt around the base of the mountain, some of them reaching about magnitude 5, strong enough to rattle a village and frighten the people in it. In truth, the mountain had been muttering for years. Rumbling had been noted from Fuji as far back as 1704. But there was no science of volcanoes then, no instruments, no alert levels, no one whose job it was to connect a swarm of tremors at the foot of a sacred mountain to the possibility that it was about to tear itself open. So the people waited inside an ordinary autumn that was quietly becoming something else. The fields had been harvested. The cold was coming on. Families along the eastern foot of Fuji prepared for winter the way they always had. While beneath them, kilometer by kilometer, magma was climbing toward the surface and mixing into a more dangerous, gas-charged form. Nobody on the ground knew it yet, but the mountain they had trusted their whole lives was about to become the most dangerous place in Japan, and it would not erupt the way anyone might have pictured it from the snow-capped summit they all knew. It would come out of the mountainside. On the 16th of December, 1707, it begins. It begins with an earthquake and then a burst of cinders and ash, not from the peak, but from the east-southeast flank of the mountain, roughly two-thirds of the way up. The ground there tears open along a line, and 3 new vents rip into existence, one after another. The mountain is not erupting from its crown. It is opening a wound in its side, in full view of the villages directly below. At first, it is ash and cinders. Within hours, the fall is reaching the settlements at the foot of the mountain, and the wind is carrying it east. But the eruption is only gathering its strength. Over the next days, it grows steadily more violent, until it is no longer just ash sifting down, but rock and stone and white-hot fragments of molten material being hurled out of the vents and arcing through the sky. This is a Plinian eruption, the most explosive kind, a column of ash and pumice driven so high it punches into the upper atmosphere. On the scale that scientists now use to rank eruptions, it rates a 5, a major event. And here is the detail that defines what is happening. There is no lava. Not a single river of molten rock flows down the mountain. Everything Fuji is doing, it is doing through the air, through what it throws up and lets fall. That will turn out to be the cruelest thing about it. A lava flow is terrifying, but slow and local. You can see it. You can walk away from it. Ash does not work that way. Ash travels on the wind, falls on everything, and waits. The prevailing winter winds over Fuji blow from west to east. And so everything the mountain is throwing into the sky is being carried in exactly one direction. Out over the cultivated fields and crowded provinces to the east and southeast, and onward toward the largest city in the country. Closest to the vents, the people of a village called Subashiri are living through the opening hours of the disaster. Subashiri sits only a few kilometers from where the ground is torn open. For its residents, there is no ambiguity, no distant plume to wonder about. The eruption is right there, above them, raining fire. Hot volcanic bombs, fragments of molten rock flung from the vents, come down on the village and set buildings alight. Thick, scalding ash piles onto the rooftops. By the time the worst of it passes, 72 houses and 3 Buddhist temples in Subashiri have been either buried under the deposit or burned where they stood. A community at the foot of the mountain is, within a few days, simply gone. Farther out, the ash arrives not as fire, but as a smothering gray fall that will not stop. Across the provinces then known as Aizu, Kai, Sagami, and Musashi, cinders and ash come down like rain. People watch it accumulate on their roofs, in their wells, across the fields they will need in the spring. There is nothing to fight and nothing to flee, only the steady, suffocating descent of the inside of a mountain onto everything they own. The numbers are hard to hold in the mind. Over the course of the eruption, Mount Fuji throws out roughly 800 million cubic meters of ash, pumice, and scoria. Near the mountain it falls thick enough to bury fields entirely, to change the shape of the land. And it is still falling, hour after hour, day after day, carried east on the winter wind, toward a city of perhaps 1 million people who think they are safely beyond reach. They are not. Nearly 100 kilometers to the east lies Edo, the seat of the shogun's government, and one of the largest cities on earth, the place we now call Tokyo. 100 kilometers is a long way from a volcano. The people of Edo are in no physical danger from the eruption, and yet, on the 16th of December and the days that follow, the sky over the capital begins to change. The sun dims. A fine, dark ash starts to sift down over the city, settling on the tile roofs and the wooden streets and the canals, getting into eyes and throats and rice bowls. In places, it lies several centimeters thick. The light fails so badly that people are said to need lamps in the middle of the day. Among those who set down what they saw is Arai Hakuseki, one of the most important scholars and officials of the age, who is living in Edo as the eruption unfolds. He records the ash falling on the city and the daylight darkening. His account is part of the reason we know, 300 years later, how the eruption looked and felt to people a full 100 kilometers from the crater. A clear winter sky turning the color of dusk at noon, and a strange black snow that was not snow at all. For the residents of the capital, it is frightening and strange, but survivable. They sweep the ash from their streets and worry about where it has come from and what it means. What they cannot yet see is that the same ash now coating their city, harmless to them, has just delivered a death sentence to the farmland between Edo and the mountain. The eruption that merely inconveniences the capital is destroying the fields that feed it. The heaviest phase of the eruption runs for about 2 weeks, with intermittent activity continuing into the new year, and the event is formally dated as ending on the 24th of February, 1708. And then the sky clears, and the real disaster begins. Ash is not soil. This is the thing the people of the Fuji region now learn in the hardest possible way. The gray layer covering their fields is sharp, sterile, and lifeless. It smothers whatever is under it and refuses to nourish anything new. The cultivated land east of the mountain, the closest and most productive farmland, is the worst buried of all under a blanket that cannot simply be plowed back into the earth. When the next growing season comes, the crops fail. In a society with no reserve, with survival measured one harvest at a time, this is the beginning of famine. Across the region east of Fuji, families who lived through the eruption itself, who watched the ash fall and survived it, now face a slower enemy. There is not enough food. Hunger spreads through the villages, and people begin to die. Not in the eruption, which killed no one whose death was recorded, but in its long shadow. It gets worse because the ruined land makes escape difficult. Contemporary accounts describe debris, floodwater, and ash blocking the roads, hemming people in, making it hard for the displaced to relocate to anywhere that might feed them. The casualties pile up quietly across the broader region around the capital, counted in the language of starvation rather than disaster. The mountain has stopped erupting. The dying has only started. There was one more way the ash could kill, and it would go on killing for the better part of a century. The farmers east of Fuji did the only sensible thing with the ash burying their fields. They scraped it off and piled it up, dumping it where they could in order to reclaim the soil underneath. But there was nowhere for it to truly go. When the rains came, they washed those piles of ash back into the streams and rivers. And the rivers were already in trouble because enormous volumes of ash had fallen directly into them during the eruption. They grew shallow, they clogged, they filled with volcanic debris until, in places, the sediment formed natural dams across the channels. The worst of it gathered in the Sakawa River, running through the Ashigara Plain to the southeast of the mountain. The river filled with ash and rock until it was choked, the water held back behind unstable barriers of volcanic material. And then, in August of 1708, came the heavy rain. The dams of ash and debris gave way. An avalanche of mud and water and volcanic sediment burst down the system and flooded across the Ashigara Plain, drowning the very farmland that had managed to survive the ashfall the winter before. This is the pattern that would define the region for generations. The ash did not wash away in a season. It sat in the hills and the riverbeds, and every heavy rain remobilized it. Major floods struck the Sakawa River again in 1711, and again in 1731, and again as late as 1802, nearly 100 years after the mountain had gone silent. A single eruption that lasted a couple of weeks had poisoned the rivers for a century. How many people did the Hōei eruption kill? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and that fact is part of the story. No one was recorded as killed by the eruption itself. There is no direct death toll because the eruption did its damage at a remove, through the failed harvests, the famine, the landslides, and the floods that came afterward. Those deaths were never tallied the way the casualties of a battle or a city fire would have been. They accumulated slowly in scattered villages over years, in the form of empty rice stores and graves dug in the off-season. The most destructive ashfall disaster in the recorded history of Japan has, at its center, a number that was simply never counted. What can be stated is the scale of the wound, roughly 800 million cubic meters of material thrown from the mountain. The village of Subashiri, stripped of 72 houses and 3 temples. The capital, 100 kilometers away, coated in centimeters of ash. An agricultural heartland buried and then repeatedly drowned. A river system turned hostile for the better part of 100 years, and the recovery fell on the whole country. The government of the shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi faced a problem with no precedent. Hundreds of square kilometers of ruined land and a river that would not stay in its banks. The Tokugawa state imposed a special tax across the realm to pay for the recovery of the Ashigara Plain, and the work of digging out the fields and fighting the recurring floods became a burden that outlasted the people who began it. The reckoning of 1707 was not one hard winter. It was generations of clearing ash and rebuilding the banks of a broken river. When the eruption ended in the early months of 1708, no one knew it would be the last time Mount Fuji erupted. They simply assumed the mountain might wake again at any time, as it had before. It never did. From that winter to this day, more than 300 years, Fuji has been silent. It is the longest quiet stretch in the mountain's recent geological history, and it is the reason millions of people now live in its shadow, thinking of it as scenery rather than as a volcano. But that silence is not the same as safety, and the scientists who study the mountain are careful to say so. Measurements of the pressure inside Fuji's magma system, reported in 2012, suggested that the internal pressure may now be even higher than it was before the 1707 eruption. Around the years 2000 and 2001, unrest beneath the mountain led researchers to conclude that fresh magma was gathering below it. And in 2011, when the magnitude 9 Tohoku earthquake struck off the northeast coast of Japan, it was followed just days later by a sharp, shallow earthquake directly beneath Fuji. A chilling rhyme with 1707, when a great offshore quake was followed 49 days later by the mountain tearing open. Japan has not ignored the warning. The authorities have modeled what a repeat of the Hōei eruption would do today, and the projection is sobering. More than 30 million people affected across Tokyo, Kanagawa, Chiba, and parts of Yamanashi, Saitama, and Shizuoka. Ash would disrupt power, water, transport, and the dense machinery of the modern capital, with damage estimated at well over $25 billion. The mountain is now wired with more than 20 seismic stations, and it is widely assumed that any future eruption would break out at or near the same Hōei vent on the southeastern flank. The same wound opened again, which is why, in the summer of 2026, the country paid close attention when the ground beneath Fuji moved. Late on the night of June 26th, a shallow earthquake of magnitude 5.6 struck the Fuji Five Lakes region at the northern foot of the mountain, shaking the town of Fujikawaguchiko hard enough to register a lower 6 on Japan's 7-point intensity scale, injuring around 10 people. The Japan Meteorological Agency urged residents to stay alert for about a week. There was no eruption. There was no tsunami. The mountain's volcanic alert level was left unchanged, and the quake was read as tectonic, not the stirring of magma. Every signal that matters still reads quiet. But the people of Japan know their history. 300 years ago, the ground shook first, and 49 days later, the mountain answered. The instruments around Fuji are listening now for exactly that sequence. For the moment, the silence ends. Because the lesson of 1707 is not that Mount Fuji is dangerous when it erupts. It is that the eruption was only the beginning, and the mountain did most of its killing slowly, through ash and hunger and water, for 100 years after the sky went dark. It can happen again. The only question Fuji has never answered is when. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Documentaries like this one take a great deal of research and care to put together, and the fact that you stayed for the whole story means more than you know. If it held your attention, consider giving it a like, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.